Hi, welcome to Bernard's Book Club, and the book that we've been looking at is Embracing Complexity by three authors: Jean Boulton, lead writer and for this film the representative of the collective authorship, made up of Boulton, and fellow contributors Peter Allen and Cliff Bauman, who have produced a really compact, lucid and compelling summation of complexity theory and the intellectual worlds it has emerged from and into which it seeks to influence. And I'm going to set out its ideas here in two sections, each with three parts. The first section I've named The Landscape and Origins of Complexity Theory, with parts called The Complexity Worldview, Philosophical and Scientific Origins, and Forests, Bringing Theory to Life. And the second section I've named Complexity and the Human World, with parts called Complexity, What's the Point?, Complexity for Understanding, and finally, Complexity for Action. So, kicking off then with Section 1, The Landscape and Origins of Complexity Theory, Part 1, The Complexity Worldview. And this is immediately addressed in its opening line. This book is about two contrasting worldviews. The first is a mechanical worldview, where the world is viewed as a machine, understood by breaking it into parts and dealing with each part separately. A machine of simple and linear causality, where A causes B, and where we can analyse facts, decide how to act, make and execute plans, and predict the future, all of which gives us a sense of order, purpose and control. And it's also a worldview whose assumptions and certainties are taken as the basis for scientific inquiry and underpin the processes of business management, policy making and organisational strategy, and for many defines the routines of their life and their role in the world. Contrasted to this, and the subject of this book, is the complexity worldview, which views the world as an organic flow to be understood holistically, akin to an organism made of a myriad of interconnected and interacting elements, producing multiple forms of non-linear causality, where events have many causes and things are in a continual process of becoming, a flow of unique and fluctuating patterns shaped by equally unique and multidimensional contexts made from innumerable elements in constant and unpredictable interplay. And it's a worldview whose assumptions run counter to our deep psychic desire for certainty, and is very much at odds with the dominant formula of management and strategy as about command and control. So first and foremost, complexity is a position on the world and how it works, and a description of the nature of things. In philosophical terms, it's an ontology, or more straightforwardly, a claim about reality itself, made, its proponents would argue, against the dominant orthodoxy and in the face of its multiple and repeated crises, in its contradictory, outdated, yet ever more entrenched mechanistic worldview, whose claim to predict and control, Boulton argues, is unachievable, destructive, and at the root of many of our current world problems, all part of a single crisis of perception which requires a radical shift in our thinking and in our values. And presenting itself as just such a radical shift, its proponents claim that complexity thinking is echoed in nature, underpinned by science, and if taken on board would change the way we think, we feel and we act, whereby understanding the world as it really is would paradoxically make our thinking and action simpler and more straightforward, freeing managers from the impossible task of measuring and controlling a machine which does not exist, and releasing us from what Boulton calls Galileo's spell, as the concocted illusion of a predictable, uniform and controllable world, as Boulton puts it, acting as if the world is measurable, controllable and predictable when it is not, does not make it so. So complexity then is primarily a mindset, but as the larger name suggests, complexity theory is also a theory, And a good way to more fully appreciate both the texture of the complexity mindset and the rigour of its theory is to organically develop our understanding of its character and theoretical position through its philosophical, spiritual and scientific forebears and founding thinkers. Indeed, given that complexity theory argues that the future is shaped by patterns established in the past, this is exactly how we should approach it, in keeping with its principles, and as such brings us to part 2, the philosophical and scientific origins of complexity theory. And here, Boulton tells us that notions of complexity have been embraced by a succession of ancient cosmologies. Thus, the very first philosophers, the so-called pre-Socratics, were not philosophers of human existence, but philosophers of nature, who wanted to explore and understand the basic matter of the universe around 2 questions. Firstly, what is the ultimate source from which all else comes? And secondly, how does this change and transform to create the infinite variety of our world? Or formulated more simply, how do things come into and out of existence? And of all these early philosophers, the philosopher Heraclitus is the most celebrated exemplar of this tradition, whose aphorism, "A man never steps into the same river twice," is widely known, and can serve here as a window into a philosophy that posits the world as a permanent flux of becoming, in which all reality flows like a river. And over the 8th to the 3rd century BCE, this image of flow, flux and multiplicity resonated across the cultures and cosmologies of what Karl Jaspers called the actual age, which simultaneously produced thinkers and philosophers across the world in a revolution of thought which he argued laid the foundations for world culture, and where ancient Greek philosophy was just one in a number of explosions of human thought, and whose fellow pillars and co-creators of new thinking, Buddha and Lao Tzu, and classic texts like the Upanishads, developed worldviews almost identical to complexity thinking, all focusing on flow, interdependency and impermanence. And you can see this in the Upanishads, written sometime between 900 to 800 BCE and prefiguring Heraclitus by centuries, where it writes, "These rivers, whilst in the sea, do not know I am this river or I am that river." Whilst a still more powerful and expansive conception of complexity can be found in the Buddhist teaching that form is a temporary state devoid of inherent existence, which emerges out of impermanent patterns and relationships, only to return to emptiness. But for Boulton, it is Taoism which best seems to capture the essence of complexity theory, emphasizing interconnection, co-creation and the newness of each moment, where novelty emerges spontaneously in the encounter between the familiar rhythms of life and the unique particularity of events, and where whatever is most enduring is ultimately overtaken in the ceaseless transformation of things. So these then are the ancient foundations for the complexity mindset, foundations which flourish briefly, but whose conceptions of complexity would be eclipsed in different ways and for a very long time by the overwhelming influence of 2 giants in the history of ideas, namely Plato and Newton. The first of these, Plato, eclipsed their conceptions of flow and multiplicity with his alternative cosmology, which argued that the physical world was a mere shadow of a higher and more real world of perfect, fixed and eternal forms, which is to say, a world that could have no place for flow and multiplicity. And not only did this idea of timeless certainty dominate Western philosophy until comparatively recently, it also became reborn in the timeless physics of Sir Isaac Newton as the second great intellectual force working to stifle the complexity worldview, confirming Platonic cosmology with all the elegance and power of modern science. And just as Plato became synonymous with philosophy, So Newton became the very paradigm of science, and the influence of both relegated the insights of Heraclitus, Buddha and Taoism, reducing their status to the level of intellectual and cultural relic, now made still more obsolete by Newtonian mechanics and its conception of a clockwork universe, all of which gave power and authority to the mechanistic worldview that has come to dominate our thinking ever since the 17th century European Enlightenment. But what would challenge all of this, and in many ways paved the way for those discarded and ancient conceptions of complexity to be themselves reborn as complexity science, was the arrival of Darwin. And of course both Newton and Darwin are seminal in the history of science. In many ways they've been its defining theorists, but each came to their science from different start points and produced different scientific models which were applied to very different contexts. Newtonian physics explains the orbits of planets, but has proved less convincing when applied to the living and ecological realms, whereas Darwin's biology applied exactly to the living and the ecological. And whereas Newton theorized the universe as a machine, predictable, unchanging, and continuing like this forever, Darwin's principle of evolution not only theorized change as the principle of all life, it also allowed us to see how new living forms which once did not exist evolved into being, not all at once, but continually building on what has already evolved, each emerging from unique circumstance and chance events to produce, in the words of Charles Peirce, arbitrary heterogeneity as the most manifest and characteristic feature of the universe. And so with Darwin then came an alternative paradigm for science, and as his evolutionary account of life became increasingly influential, so the forgotten ideas of complexity have re-emerged and are now producing a growing range of critiques and alternatives to the mechanistic worldview, including holism, chaos theory, systems thinking, cybernetics, and of course complexity theory. So that complexity, in a very general and non-linear way, might be seen to have moved from insight to mindset, to critique, and finally into fully fledged and comprehensive theory. And for Boulton, while many have contributed to this body of work over the years, it is the Nobel-Prize-winning theoretical chemist Ilya Prigogine, who is the defining theorist of complexity and whose work best illustrates its foundational principles. And here, Boulton tells us that Prigogine's imagination was captured by the disconnect between physics and biology, whereby physics, through the second law of thermodynamics, theorizes the universe as moving inexorably to decay, disorder, and entropy, while biology, following Darwin's evolutionary principle, theorizes life as moving inexorably into ever more complex forms and multiplicity. And this was a contradiction which Prigogine, influenced by Darwin, made it his life's work to reconcile, and whose 1977 Nobel-Prize-winning solution to the conundrum was to distinguish between the universe as a whole, which is correctly theorized as a closed system, and the many small or local parts of that universe, not least our own planet, which should be theorized as open systems. And whereas closed systems stand alone, cannot be influenced by external forces and decay over time, open systems are shaped by their environment, subject to the forces of evolution, and are compelled towards complexity. And in these award-winning insights, Prigogine was able not only to reconcile physics with biology, he would also position evolution as the indispensable frame to understand our world in all its interacting complexity. And in this way, the conceptual armoury of evolution became the intellectual foundation for a new and comprehensive theory of complexity, where change, creativity, adaptation, variation, fluctuation, events, chance and selection become the theoretical tools to understand the processes and dynamics of change, which, like natural selection, can create order out of disorder, and in so doing create entirely new structures, and where the future unfolds through patterns that have been established in the past, or, as complexity theory has it, patterns that are path-dependent, interacting with and changed by events or variations in particular times and specific places in a never-ending process of becoming, where the future is under perpetual construction and is not only uncertain but can take more than one path, where pattern systems with multiple feedback loops, elements that can change, learn and adapt, connections that can deepen, loosen or transform, boundaries that can shift over time, and parts working synergistically in ever-shifting configurations of relationship, all vibrate, oscillate and tip into the future. Here then is Prigogine's complexity template for a complex world that is systematic and cannot be understood by looking to its parts, path-dependent, where history and the sequence of events are key to shaping the future, contextual, depending on particular events, circumstances and patterns of relationship, diverse, with multi-scaled and multifaceted elements, connections and interactions, emergent, with new structures and patterns always coming into being, episodic, where change happens in fits and starts, and liable to tipping in explosive moments of radical transformation. And all of this was further developed into a credible worldview through mathematical modelling, with a vast array of different and distinctive predictive calculations, each with their own corresponding concepts, framing ideas, simplifications and assumptions as to what to include and what to leave out, and such is the range, indeed the complexity of all these, that Boulton spends a whole chapter on this, introducing readers to a conceptual world of mathematical modelling and its lexicon of attractor basins, power laws, deterministic chaos and state space, all different guiding concepts seeking to represent the reality of change via mathematical equations. And the range of these is really quite bewildering, with some looking at one particular aspect in detail and others looking at all possible dimensions, some assuming the most probable outcome, others all possible outcomes, and some deterministic, where the outcome is set by initial conditions, but the model most in keeping with the principles of complexity, and the one most recommended by Boulton, is the so-called evolutionary complex models, precisely because they explore the dynamics of change and the emergence of new patterns and structures. And all this intellectual development has taken complexity theory into ever greater abstractions which have been massively enabled by the exponential increase of computing power. And whilst this has greatly extended the credibility and the predictive power of complexity theory, Boulton cautions the reader that these remain simplifying abstractions, which run the risk of reverting to the kind of certainties for which it has criticised mechanistic science, to simply produce a more sophisticated version of old convictions with a new and more complicated tool for the certainty toolkit. And in addition to this, abstractions necessarily take us away from real life, and it's probably with that in mind that Boulton and her fellow authors have sought to provide a more grounded explanation of complexity by looking how it applies to the life cycle of forests. And with that in mind, and to further develop the concept, we now move to part 3, Forests, Bringing Theory to Life. And in the book, Boulton introduces this by stating, one study that we feel really helps bring alive a sense of what it means to say the world is complex is based on the real-life observations of forests made by Buzz Holling. Here, Holling argues that healthy forests have an adaptive cycle of growth, collapse, regeneration and new growth, And although this neat trajectory, which can be recorded as a journey from chaos to maturity and back again, is far from a universal template, it does allow us to more fully visualize complexity as a process and more tangibly appreciate its workings over the different phases of the forest cycle. In its earliest growth phase, the forest is in a chaotic state, with huge amounts of diversity and little structure. Anything might happen, all is new, and there is no settled pattern. But as flows of energy and materials between forest organisms become steadily more numerous and complex, it creates the potential for the forest to self-organise in numerous and at this stage random ways, not dictated by any external agency or overarching principle. Instead, species begin to settle into balancing relationships between predators and prey, or in new synergistic and cooperative couplings. As it matures, this vibrating web of relationships begins to progressively self-regulate, with less diversity and more stability, but still enough variation to constantly adapt to fluctuating conditions and external shocks. And as this continues into the late growth phase, these mechanisms of self-regulation deepen to produce fewer and more finely tuned organisms, progressively more specialised and efficient. And as the forest adapts to maximise the production of biomass from the flows of sunlight, water and nutrients, the unused potential of species and patterns from outside the emerging structure now coming into being are pruned away as the forest moves to a state of optimum efficiency, with fewer species and the relationships between them far more precise and tightly defined. Paradoxically, it's in this stage and in this constellation of specialist species and sharply defined patterns of relationship that we can see how evolutionary progression is not an automatic and universal good. And that's because specialism in the name of efficiency comes at the cost of resilience, as it leads to less diversity, less flexibility, and less capacity to adapt. And relationships in the present and pathways into the future become fixed and rigid. And because, like all of human life and culture, the forest is an open system, it becomes more and more vulnerable to sudden environmental change. As Boulton puts it, although the forest is efficient in that it has evolved to use all its resources, it is not resilient to shocks. If there is a fire or an invasion of a rampant new species or a significant change in climate, this balanced ecosystem is prone to collapse. And already, even in this still rather technical description, we can see not only more of the colour and texture of complexity in action, but we can also glimpse into the complexity of our own very specialised and very vulnerable human world. And looking at forests in this way also helps to complete our unfolding definition of complexity theory by demonstrating two final and central concepts to complete our picture of complexity, both of which are familiar, but which take on greater significance as part of the complexity frame. The first of these is the idea of lock-in. Whereas in the forest example, those species and the patterns between them best adapted to one set of condition and favoured by chance and events become dominant at the expense of other potential alternatives that may be better suited to the welfare of the overall system. And the second is the idea of the tipping point, as characteristic of change under conditions of complexity, and what most of us would recognise as an irresistible runaway point of no return, where the system shifts from one state or one regime to another. Both concepts that are particularly important to the application of complexity theory to the human world, which brings us to Section 2, Complexity and the Human World, Part 1, Complexity, What's the Point? And I've posed this question because it may legitimately be asked, if this world of seemingly countless interconnecting and interacting elements, of non-linear and co-creating causality, of flow and fluctuation in multidimensional contexts, if such a world can be known at all. And if this is true for the natural world, it's even more so for the human one, where constellations of complexity are still further and greatly expanded to now include the unique and largely intangible attributes of human beings, of their meaning-making, intentions, thinking, feeling, deciding, interacting and learning, and where a multitude of individual histories, personalities, beliefs, dispositions and moods, each part of their own discrete system of family, friends, neighbourhood, region, society and so on, all now part of this great carnival of seemingly infinitely layered, complex co-creation, which in human terms has macro, social, economic, political and environmental patterns and structures such as war, population growth, political and economic inequality or climate change, simultaneously shaping and shaped, consciously and unconsciously, by human actors and their micro-world of variation, chance, randomness and unique events, such as whether the stock market drops, there's an oil leak in the Atlantic, a currency crisis in Europe, or unrest in the Middle East, and even prosaic occurrences such as who turns up to a meeting or what the weather was like on that day, all now part of the dance between capricious detail and semi-permanent structure that make up the nature of things. But like it or not, this is our modern world, or put differently, it's our condition of late modernity, a condition that Boulton illustrates by the way of how we now buy food. Once a relatively simple decision, determined by what was available or grown and reared locally, but now shaped by global markets, transport costs, competition between supermarkets, special deals, the internet, TV chefs, advertising, health advice, concern over animal cruelty and the environment, and food fashion. But despite all of this, Boulton argues ours is still a world that, if we cannot know it completely, is one that we can better understand, and certainly better than our current comforting but illusionary claim to predictive certainty. Of course, to appreciate this requires certain things, that we acknowledge the limits of what we can realistically know, adopt a less hubristic and more humble approach, accept the existence of unknown unknowns, and embrace the idea of doubt and multiple causality. And if we do this, such an approach reframes rather than excludes the knowable. And while the future remains uncertain, it is not random. Patterns and regularities can and do persist, and we can engage with these empirically, and from there make sound judgments as how to best to act in such a world. And so, to answer my own question, this is indeed the point of complexity theory, which seeks to position itself in the middle ground between a view of the world as a machine and the fantasy that we can control that machine, and a view of the world as unpredictable chaos and the pessimism of blind fate, so that, far from surrendering to complexity overwhelm, complexity theory, as described by Boulton and her co-authors, offers not only a better and more realistic understanding of the world, but also a new methodology for human action. And this is very much the promise and the pitch of this book. As Boulton puts it, our intention is to raise the question as to what complexity has to offer in many diverse arenas relevant to management and policy and the way we live our lives. And so, having spent the first half of the book detailing the origin and landscape of complexity theory, the second half is very much concerned with its applications, with chapters devoted to complexity and, respectively, management, strategy, international development and economics. But for this presentation, the various insights offered over these chapters I've organised under two headings to capture what complexity theory has to offer for the human world, as namely, firstly, to better understand it, and secondly, to more effectively act within it, which brings us to part 2, complexity and understanding. And here, of the many examples she uses, I've chosen 2. One to illustrate the continued hold of the kind of misplaced and mechanical certainties that complexity stands in opposition to, and a second to illustrate the kind of phenomena that complexity now makes explicable where it wasn't before, both of which are only a few of the many illustrations that she gives. The first of these is neoclassical economics, and it's utilised here to demonstrate the mistake of appropriating physics with its unchanging and predictable laws of nature in order to make it the intellectual foundation for an economic theory. In the case of neoclassical economics, it was the theory of gases and liquids, or more precisely its laws of equilibrium, that it sought to take from physics and make its own, in order that it might establish its own law, that economies naturally reach equilibrium through, among other things, the law of supply and demand, the price mechanism, and an unregulated economy. A formula that today is known as neoliberal economics, or for its critics, market fundamentalism, and which since 1979 has more than any other idea, political actor, or material force transformed societies, penetrated the material life and psyche of virtually everyone on the planet, and dominates culture and politics across the world. Of course, the complexity critique of this kind of economics is not new, and Boulton acknowledges this, telling us that over 100 years ago, Thorstein Veblen, a late 19th century economist influenced by Darwin, utilising evolution and utterly scathing of neoclassical models, explored and exposed almost every aspect of what would become neoliberalism. With its misplaced embrace of thermodynamics and law-based models of equilibrium, and a doctrine which, desperate for the authority of predictive and objective science, had abandoned its early beginnings as political economy, which in the hands of Smith, Mill, Malthus, Ricardo and Marx had addressed issues holistically, seeing multiple interconnections between economics and society, but which now had become, via differential calculus, increasing levels of abstraction and oversimplified assumptions, the fantasy machine economics of perfect self-balancing equilibrium, all premised on the equally misplaced understanding of the economy as a closed system, immune from the external world, shifts in climate, and the power structures and conflicts of society, and which at its centre stands what has been called Homo economicus, the autonomous choosing individual of pure reason and equal social power, who fully comprehends their interests and is possessed of perfect information and always makes consistent and rational choices. In contrast stands the complexity view that presents the economy, like all social structures, as open systems of multiple connections and synergies, penetrated by considerations of politics and power, values and ethics, but which are hidden in a haze of economic data points and safely excluded by the arbitrary boundaries of so-called classical economics, masking moral choices by translating them into the mythologies of equilibrium and perfect competition. Equally, the choosing individual of the neoliberal imagination, so-called economic man, is in reality a complex of habits and thoughts, economic perhaps, but also sexual, humanitarian and devotional, influenced by multiple concerns and agendas, acting according to varied worldviews and values, and whose decisions are influenced by the interplay of a multitude of unpredictable factors, including macro considerations of war, natural disaster, or the price of oil, but also by micro considerations, such as whether certain heads of state get along, the collapse of a particular government, or the downfall of a key decision maker following a scandal. So, from the complexity perspective, mechanistic economics tells us little about our material life, And more crucially, the real-life effects of such impoverished thinking are profound. We're just as in the forest life cycle described earlier, where dominant species become locked in, so the global financial system and wider capitalist economy, produced and legitimated by neoliberal economics, becomes a textbook illustration of lock-in, where positive feedback loops make the powerful still more powerful. And like the forest, which moves into its phase of specialist maturity with fewer and progressively more finely tuned organisms, becoming correspondingly less diverse and less resilient, so as global capitalism moves ever deeper into its own ever narrower and brittle effectiveness regime, numerous bad future possibilities become ever more probable and collapse more likely. Speculating on how this may play out, Boulton argues it may require very strong and powerful interventions, or it may be impossible to change, in which case it may eventually just collapse, either as a result of something like the unforeseen runaway consequences of a new financial instrument, or as a consequence of broad changes to the environment, such as big shifts in demography, a drastic fall in people's confidence in the economic system, or shocks due to climate change, war, or disease. All of which brings us to politics as the second example, now utilised to show how complexity facilitates a better understanding, this time illustrating the kind of phenomena that complexity now makes explicable where it wasn't before. But before briefly developing this, it's worth saying that for readers of the book, this choice of politics might be a bit surprising, given that there is no chapter devoted to this. But as the previous discussion makes clear, locked-in power plays a central role in complexity, where, as Boulton puts it, issues of power and influence are part of the complexity of the situation and cannot be ignored, while raising issues of complexity with their focus on uncertainty and limits to knowledge and control can be seen in itself as a political issue. And beyond this, many of complexity themes and concepts echo political thought. Its position that economic policies and decisions are themselves inherently political. Its recognition of path dependency, which includes, amongst other things, human histories of empire and imperial expansion, and the way that the development of regimes and structures is episodic, where just as there are times of evolutionary explosion in the natural world, so tipping points, collapse, and the emergence of new regimes are a feature of the human world. Indeed, in at least this one aspect, both complexity theory and Marxism predict system collapse from internal contradictions. But it's perhaps in making sense of the unexpected where complexity theory can most assist our political understanding of the world. And this I thought was vividly illustrated when on page 25 Boulton argues, as we write, there is a state of flux in the Ukraine, which seems to have been exploited by various factions to further deep-seated aims. Thus, whilst a country may appear stable for decades, any loosening of the structures of the system may permit long-suppressed interest to emerge and shape the unfolding situation. But these processes are neither linear nor gradual, and a societal system can tip into a new regime in a matter of days rather than decades. Written in 2015, this perfectly anticipates the collapse of the Syrian regime almost a decade later, which came as a universal shock to even the most eminent political scientists and historians of the region. Indeed, the unexpected is now an increasing feature of our politics, as witnessed by the sudden appearance of the DeepSeek AI program emerging from China, with all the implications this has for the international balance of power. And it's worth saying here that the next book that we'll be looking at will be End Times by Peter Turchin, which applies complexity theory to the political future of the West. But for now, and to gain some traction in how to navigate such a world, I'll now turn to the very brief final part of this presentation, complexity for action. And here, Boulton tells us, although complexity emphasises limits on prediction and control, its concern is not just to understand what's happening, but to decide what to do next. And she goes on to insist that human agency in the face of complexity is at its critical heart, a claim substantiated over chapters dealing with management, strategy and international development, which in their different ways and contexts demonstrates how the capacity for us to take action is built into its theory, addressed in its advice, looks to specific qualities and is practically illustrated. And I'll now complete this presentation by taking each of these in turn. Taking its theory first, it was Ilya Prigogine, its defining theorist, who first identified that instant between chaos and the beginnings of self-organisation, earlier illustrated in the forest cycle, as a moment of what he called bifurcation, which is to say, a moment where the unfolding future can go in more than one direction or take more than one path, and where in a human context a crossroads is reached and a moment of choice becomes possible, and where human intention and aspiration actually becomes part of the synergizing constellations taking place, joining, penetrating and interacting with the other factors, which is to say that human will actually becomes part of the complexity, interacting with and affecting the self-organisation process, so that any specifically human tipping point is also full of human opportunity. Something, I have to say, that was intuitively understood by Lenin on the eve of the Russian Revolution. And turning now to the advice that flows from this, well, this is broadly the same for the business strategist as it is for the revolutionary, namely to have a clear objective, a vigilant appreciation for what is and is not possible, and the utmost flexibility in the execution of your goal, which is to say, prepare for and notice the unexpected, the unanticipated and the unintended, adapt to changing circumstances and always be ready to respond. Boulton puts this into the straightforward advice to look up, down, backwards and forwards, looking up and down at the particulars and specifics of the context, which in a social setting could include such things as the demography, education, levels of inequality and wealth, and the socio-economic and political structures of society. Looking back to understand what led to the present and what deep-seated institutionalised factors might be in play, such as the legacies of empire, wars, colonialism, or the history of any given government's actions, and looking forward to scan for changes, explore scenarios and foresight the future, all the time looking for what might be possible and what opportunities or threats might be emerging. And again, this corresponds to the political skill set, in this case to Machiavelli's advice for power and agency through the application of political intelligence and well-judged action, and requiring, if not a prince, then a leader able to handle ambiguity, synthesize complex information, apply judgment and act even when information is patchy and contradictory. Or, as Boulton puts it, in the more sober context of management and business strategy, to gather information, trail changes, conduct experiments and learn, all part of an unfolding, evolving and coordinated set of actions, initiatives, experiments and change initiatives that she characterises as a reflexive process of managed emergence, building capacities for the future and making use of existing capabilities in new combinations. And finally, amongst the numerous case studies of the practical implementation of complexity-based interventions, she cites the Hunger Safety Net Programme, an international NGO operating in Turkana in northern Kenya, a place marginalised by government where drought, instability, corruption, poverty and poor infrastructure was locked in, but whose goal to provide its people with the capacity to purchase food in the face of drought stands as an exemplary and successful illustration of complexity in action. Building on what had gone before, learning over time, taking into account the history of Turkana, customising its actions to local culture, climate and terrain, with a programme designed to synergistically weave together multiple actors, including national banks and local traders, utilising technology such as thumbprint activated smart cards and solar powered ATM machines, and achieving numerous goals, including combating corruption and empowering households, retailers, traders and fishermen, all of which, in the words of Boulton, shows what can be achieved when actors reflect, experiment and learn from experience, where problems are dealt with and unintended consequences faced, and shows the power for change if several issues are tackled together adaptively and synergies are found and exploited. And so completes Embracing Complexity, a rich and comprehensive introduction to a really important and valuable theoretical perspective, which is increasingly becoming utilised in the understanding of our increasingly complex world.